All right, and welcome to the 5 things to improve your application security program. I thought about this. I actually just did a presentation down at InfoSec World 2016 in Orlando, and there was a lot of stuff going on down there. And I did a presentation specifically towards application security, and there's a lot that comes out of it. And there's so many things that we can think about when we talk about an application security program. And it's hard to do everything, right? There's so much going on. How do I know all the things I need to do? And we're never going to be able to do all of them. And so I started thinking about how typically we approach application security, and it's very much heavy around static analysis and dynamic analysis and running certain tools and building up your SDLC. Well, in this presentation, I'm not going to focus as much around building up an SDLC. Some of the things we're going to talk about are going to integrate into the SDLC, but this is really less about specifics of being able to go in and do the SDLC and necessarily secure coding and secure development related. And it's really more towards just kind of a high level overview of things that we can think about to help us improve that program. And that's what I want to focus on is other things, not specifics, not going in and saying, you got to do threat modeling and you got to do static analysis and you got to do risk analysis and you got to do this. We know we've heard this stuff over and over again, right? We get this stuff every time. So I want to go past that. I want to go further into the system and I want to think about some of the things we need to think about. So as we go through, if you've not been on one of my webcasts before or seen me present before, my name is James Jardine. I am the CEO of Jardine Software, where we specialize, and I'll talk more about this at the very end actually, in application security related services. I spent multiple years doing security consulting. Before that, I did application development for a long time. I actually started out in the wonderful world of VB6 and then moved into .NET around 2001, 2002 when the beta releases of .NET was coming out. And I've really pretty much kind of stuck to .NET from a development standpoint, but from a security aspect and application security aspect, I kind of cover the whole realm of things. I've spent a lot of time doing some instructing. I actually help author or co-author and teach the SANS Dev 544, which is secure coding in .NET course. I also have taught some web pen testing courses, mobile pen testing courses. I've presented at many different venues. So I've got a lot of experience kind of getting around in the industry. And that I think helps, having a broad development understanding and security understanding really kind of helps put these things together. Because oftentimes what we see is we have developers and they don't really have a lot of the insights into the security side of things and not just secure coding, but kind of how attackers work, how attacks work, how they can be exploited, why they would be exploited. We don't often see that side. And then we have the other side where we have the people that have solid security experience, but they don't really have the dev experience. Yeah, they can identify flaws and they have some understanding of those, but they don't really have that background of how development really works and how we go about that process. So I like that having that mixed background kind of gives me a special insight into some things. And, I tend to happen to maybe have some different opinions or different views of how things should work. But, I want to shake things up. I want to get people thinking about things differently. We've been doing application security for a long time, but we're still kind of stagnant with it, and so we want to figure out how to fix this up a little bit. I also blog quite a bit, not as much as I'd like to. I need to get some more out there, but I also do podcasting as well, talking about application security topics. So this is where I put my focus is application security and helping companies realize their potential with application security and get more value out of that as they go through it. So today, what are we going to really start talking about? Well, why do we even need improvement? I mean, everybody's got an AppSec program or some resemblance of one. Where are we really on that? Really big focus when we start getting into these kind of things we can do, getting the app teams involved. This is going to be huge. identifying their skill sets and their resources that we have, right? And this is both from what do we have internally from devs and QA and BA, but also what type of skill sets are we looking for? So start thinking about that as we're going through this of what type of skill sets do we typically see from the testing side, the hacker side of things, and then start thinking about some of the skill sets that we see from a development side, from an application team side, and where those kind of intermingle. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through this. We're also going to talk heavily about training because, I mean, to put it simply, if we don't know, then we're not going to be able to do things. So even from a security perspective, if I've got security personnel that don't know certain things, well, we have to be able to provide some sort of training, whether that's formalized or self-learning, whatever it is, to these teams so that way they can start understanding what they need to know. And this falls back to the point before that, identifying skill sets and resources. We're going to talk about kind of briefly the idea of the application inventory. Some of you may have this, most probably do not. But this is important. This is something that's going to help your program out as a whole. This isn't to a specific language. This isn't to a specific application. This is our holistic view of our application security program. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about defining some policy and procedure and why that's important, because if we don't have those, we don't kind of have that guiding light to get us through where we want to go. So why do I need application security? Well, some of it may be this guy on here, right? The guy sitting down in his grandma's basement hacking away at your computer because that seems fun to him. Things have changed over the years. It used to be that network level, infrastructure level, that was where things were happening. And then we started really implementing firewalls and, we've got WAFs now. We've got all these different edge devices and all this in place that now makes it much more difficult from an external perspective to get into the systems through infrastructure related. Now, don't get me wrong, we certainly still have infrastructure related issues. A lot of those relate to patching, services that get left out on the edge, just kind of wide open. Nobody knows about them. We certainly have that as a vector to get in. But a lot of attacks we see these days really aren't against the network layer. We're seeing them either against the application layer, or we're seeing them through social engineering, through phishing campaigns, which oftentimes take advantage of application flaws. Because if I'm going to send a phishing email, if I can send it to your organization, and in that I'm actually taking advantage of a flaw within one of your applications. So say you've got reflective cross-site scripting in one of your applications. Well, if I can send one of your employees an email regarding that application and the link has cross-site scripting, but they don't notice it, but they see that, oh yeah, that's my organization. That is our domain. That's a valid link. I'm not going anyplace malicious. They click it because they trust it. And now it actually executes because there's a flaw in the application. Well, that's much easier to pull off than trying to get you to go to some site that looks nefarious, right? That doesn't look like you should trust it. So we have to think about that from an application security standpoint, because we don't want people leveraging our own systems. A lot of stuff comes down to, we talk a lot of trust. We talk about social engineering and teaching people how to understand what looks like phishing, what doesn't look like a phishing. And trust me, that's a whole nother webcast that we'll go over, talking about social engineering and awareness around that. But it helps show us that applications are becoming that kind of hot piece. We've got lots of vulnerabilities in applications. Look out there. There's all kinds of breaches going on. Everybody's got vulnerabilities. There's all kinds of reports that come out talking about the number of vulnerabilities out there. We have application security issues. The good news is we can do things to help reduce these and maybe lower the risk, but it's going to have to require an understanding of our systems, what we're doing, our processes, our policies. There's a lot that we have to do on our side. The bad news is it's really hard to be even 90% secure. never mind 100%, which you're never going to get to. But it's hard to get there because there's just so many moving pieces. And while some of application security may be very simple, right? I mean, fixing most cross-site scripting is pretty straightforward. It's just updating a line of code for that item. Still, you have testing. There's lots of stuff that goes into it, but the concept is pretty simple. And then you've got things that are actually really complex. But if we don't really understand how to manage these pieces, then that makes it even worse, right? If we don't have good collaboration, if we don't have good training internally, if our policies aren't there, then we really kind of have some issues. So then we might wonder, well, maybe I've got a program, but does it actually need improvement? Well, I mean, it's pretty easy to say, right? I mean, we can always do improvement on something. There's always room for improvement within any of our programs. And with application security, I find when I look at different enterprises and I go into different organizations, it varies so greatly between everybody's groups. You know, some people have huge security groups. Some people have very small security groups. You know, some people are doing static analysis and dynamic analysis. Other people do none of that. You know, and there's really no baseline across the industry of how many people are doing what. So it's kind of a free for all. You know, there's some guides out there you can look at if you've seen things like BSIM or OpenSAM. You know, these building security in maturity models where we can say, hey, look, I want to be a level 1, and that requires me to do X, Y, and Z. And then once I start getting there, now I can go to be a level 2, and that's going to add these pieces, right? So there's always room for improvement. Maybe you do static analysis now, and down the road you want to add dynamic analysis. Do I think you have to have every different type of scanning technology and everything out there to be successful at application security? No, I think every organization is different. I think the skill sets in each organization is very different. So you have to understand your organization to be able to understand what the next step is. But I think there's always room for improvement. And what I think we need to think about when we talk about improvement is that it's not going to all happen overnight. We're not going to make huge changes and it's just going to happen magically, right? This is small course correction. I give the example, it's like playing darts. I grew up playing darts, not professionally by any mean, right? But, you know, just hanging out. Hey, we're bored. We throw darts. And one of the things I learned really early on was you don't make major course correction when you're doing something like throwing darts, right? If you're shooting for the bullseye and you're off to the right, you don't try to throw left, right? Because immediately you're now way off to the left because you overcorrect. You actually take it very simple and you try almost throw it very similar to what you just did with very small correction. But if you think too much about it, you overcorrect. And now you're on the other side. And you just keep bouncing back and forth on the sides of the bullseye because you keep overcorrecting. So we have to think about it from that aspect is nothing's going to happen overnight. There are some things that may change quickly. There are other things that may take months or even a year or two to get fully implemented within an organization, depending on how you're set up to be able to make that happen. So don't look for overnight change. Look for those small changes that make a big difference. So the first thing I want to talk about, breaking the silo. This is something that has plagued me since I've, I think, been in security industry. We like to spend a lot of time kind of separating security from application. And it's fine to have some separation, right? I mean, it's kind of like, oh, well, we're an independent third party. We can view things. But we tend to try to take on too much ourselves. Oftentimes, I go into organizations and I see where the security group is actually trying to do everything they think needs to be done, and they're not utilizing the rest of the team. We have bad collaboration where there's no communication. I handed over a talk a few years ago, and it was based around, and the idea behind it was, basically here we are at the high school dance, and you've got application teams on one side of the dance floor, you got security on the other side, and nobody really wants to be the first one to go across and start intermingling and talking with the other. And that's a big problem we have. We're not real good at collaborating and communicating either way, right? This isn't just a security thing, but security's not good at it. They're real good at saying devs suck, applications suck, their code is horrible, right? We're really good at saying that because that's just easy. But it doesn't help us when we're actually trying to build an AppSec program. And what I find is the better AppSec programs I see is because they've already figured out the communication piece. They've figured out how to be able to communicate with the developers and be able to be positive, right? Be able to still say, hey, look, this is broken, but they're able to do it in a way where it's not coming off as, hey, this is no good. I don't deal with this. You deal with this. Have a good time. Let me know when you're finished. And your release isn't going out until this is done. There's a lot better ways that we can go about this where we work more with the teams. If you're in a small office and you have the ability to sit, if you're in security and you have the ability to sit over with the devs or the QAs or the application teams in general, if you're sitting in their area, you gain more trust. You gain the ability to have more collaboration because they're seeing you all the time. It's not the, oh man, here comes the AppSec guy. Now we're in trouble. What did we do? This is going to be a lot of work for us to handle, right? We can't, that's not a good situation when we're talking about collaboration between the groups, right? We want development to feel comfortable going to security with their concerns, or maybe not even concerns, just, hey, we're doing something. I wanted to let you know, get your feedback on it. Knowing that security is not going to run around like the sky is falling and try to put a stop on everything and halt everything, but they actually take it realistically. They listen to what's being said. We have conversation about what's being said. Everybody starts gaining that understanding, right? So communication and collaboration becomes critical in our environments. Again, I mentioned security can't do it all. And one of the big things I see, and I use this example a lot. I was in an organization and I was asking them, they use Web Inspect internally for app scanning, for dynamic scanning. And I said, well, who runs that? And it was the security group that runs it. And this is probably very typical across many organizations. The security group maintains that tool. They run the tool. So what do you need to run Web Inspect? You put in a URL, you put in some credentials for the application, you hit go. There's a few more things you may do. There may be some tweaking that you want to do to get a better scan. Some of these tools allow quite the configuration, which is fine. But when I asked, why don't you have the devs or QA run that tool for you? Because you're holding up the process because they have to finish, then they have to put a request in. You run it when you get a chance, you get the responses back. They don't actually get access into the tool, so they get some 300-page PDF report that's got requests and responses and pretty much throw it in the garbage. It's not useful at all, right? And this is a big problem. We want it to be useful for them. So we run into this issue, and I say, well, why don't you have the devs run that tool? Well, they wouldn't understand. It's too complex for them. And I always look very, very perplexed when I hear that type of response, because I think you're either talking from the dev side, the people that write your complex business functionality and business logic, they're writing these applications, or even from the QA side who are doing possibly complex testing, right? They're all about automating. They deal with logging into the apps. They understand the apps. And you think they can't pull off putting in a URL and some credentials into a GUI web interface? I'm perplexed by it because they can do that, right? Here's a situation where we can take a step back and look at it and think, wow, what if I had them doing this instead of me? How much more time would that save me so I could focus on some of the other things that we're going to talk about? And from a dev perspective, how nice would it be if I was dev or QA, where I actually get access into the system? I can run it in its native interface. And that way I can see the results. It's in a nice GUI. I can click on individual items. I can drill down in, see what I need to see so I can start taking appropriate actions to fix this, versus getting this huge PDF report that I have to read through, and it's hard to read. I don't even know where vulnerabilities start and stop. It's just ugly, right? So we want to look for different things that we can do where we can say, hey, maybe I don't need to do this. Somebody else can do this. And same from the other side, maybe somebody can say, hey, I can run that tool. You don't have to do that. You can go focus on this other stuff, whatever that may be, whether that's red teaming, whether that's policy creation, whatever it is, we can open that up. But we have to start remembering, right? We build these silos up because we don't want to be part of the IT organization from a security perspective. But really, from an application security standpoint, we're not going to get better app security until we start breaking those silos down and start treating us like separate entities and start all kind of working as the same team. We all have the same end goal. We want quality applications that are serving up our business, making money for our companies. That's what we want. Some of us just focus on different things, but we don't need to sit completely in our own bubbles. It's not going to work, right? And then we want to set our expectations. What do we expect from the dev teams? What do we expect from ISO or our security groups or risk groups? Who's responsible for what? And when we start talking about responsibility and accountability, it comes down to who's accountable for application security. I mean, when we think about it, app teams are responsible, right? It's their app. They're the only ones that can write the code. They're the ones focused on testing it. It's their app. And ultimately, they're the ones with business side of things that are making these decisions of, hey, are we willing to accept the risk of potential security flaws versus delaying releases, right? What is that return on investment? Because as sad as it is, it doesn't always come down to, well, you have cross-site scripting, you can't go. What's the cost I'm going to lose by not going, right? And that's how business works. And obviously, it has to focus on, we're protecting company data, we're protecting consumer data, we're protecting our customers. That's got to be a priority. But also remember that a lot of flaws may be pushed or decisions are made from a corporate level, right or wrong, based on what they believe the end outcome is going to be or what the chances of something happening are. Just because you have a cross-site scripting in an application, it may be so limited down, nobody's really going to find that. It's in a piece of functionality that's available to one user in the entire system. Well, you could look back and say, well, you have cross-site scripting, so you're vulnerable, you can't go. Or you can look at it more deeply and say, well, here's the real case scenario, and chances of this being identified or being used or being exploited are so low that, this can wait till next release to be resolved, or no, we have to do it now, right? We want to make those decisions. So that's where we start seeing it's not just app teams, right? App teams are responsible. Security is responsible, right? There's some accountability from the security group, right? Because a lot of times they're defining policies, they're producing guidelines that we'll talk about. They're involved with a lot of that. They have the best understanding of security of everybody else, right? So there's accountability there. Management making those decisions that I was talking about. Do we go? Do we not go? How do we proceed? The company as a whole. Everybody plays a part in application security. But unfortunately, what we typically see is that it's the security group that plays that biggest part, and everybody wants to dump all accountability and responsibility on the security group. But that doesn't really work because, again, they don't write the code. They may not even understand the code. And for us to be able to go through and make sure that our security groups have the expertise to understand every language that's being used in the organization and every possible flaw, there's a lot of information to know. It's similar to doing development. There's a lot to know, a lot of nitty gritty out there, and it's all in the details. So we can't expect everything to be held there. We have to look everywhere. We have to realize that everybody's involved in this process. So I like doing this quick little thing here. It's a quick little technical question, and then this helps kind of point out everybody needs to be involved. So typically what I'll do, and this is a common code snippet, three different code snippets I'll show, and they're very simple, but it's .NET code, and it's to ask a simple question, right? Which ones of these, many, none, all, present a security risk based on something like cross-site scripting for the first two or CRLF injection for the last one, can you easily spot out from a security perspective which ones are vulnerable and which ones are not? And quite honestly, a lot of devs don't really know, but this is something you'll see in the static analysis, right? So when we talk about who's responsible for what and approving different things, we want to make sure that the people that understand this code, and this is just a very simple snippet, understand the repercussions. So is it easy to look at this and be able to pick out? Now, maybe you're not .NET developers, and that's fine. There's no expectation there. But again, if you know people in ISO and they're the ones making decisions on whether something is a vulnerability or it's not a vulnerability, or they're trying to explain this, do they understand this? So let's look at the first one. txtf name.txt equals request.form, and it's pulling in the name that the user submitted. Okay, well, TXT, we'll go ahead. I'll clarify this is a text box in ASP.NET Web Forms. Well, is it vulnerable or not? And this is sometimes tricky for people, but actually in this case, it is not, right? And the reason it's not is because by default, Web Forms auto-encode their text property of their text box control. So you don't have to put encoding around this. Typically, if you were to see something like this, you'd see an HTML encode wrapped around the request.form. But text boxes auto-encode, right? And again, now this is .NET specific. If this was Java, if this was PHP, different answers. And honestly, I don't know right off the top of my head because they're different frameworks. So we don't really know what those are going to be. Well, how about this? We have a label. So this is a label control in ASP.NET. Would this be vulnerable to cross-site scripting? By the looks of it, I mean, if you just saw the text box one, you say, oh, text box, yeah, must be. Well, who knows what Microsoft was thinking. Label controls do not encode their data by default. So a label control actually would be vulnerable. Now, you may get somebody that responds and says, well, there's request validation and that's enabled, so we can't do it. Request validation can be bypassed. There's multiple ways to do it. You can't rely on just the input validation there for protection. So this would actually be a valid finding. And if I saw this in application code, I would let the developers know what the issue was and recommend them that they use some sort of encoding algorithm to be able to output encode that to make sure we protect against cross-site scripting. Now, our final one here, response headers.add, and we're adding a custom header. Now, this isn't cross-site scripting, although kind of similar. But what we're looking for here is carriage return line feed injection, CRLF injection. And this is where you can actually inject a new line into the response headers and then add your own headers. You could break out of headers and add content. There's lots of stuff you can do with this, and it can get pretty nasty. But the question is this vulnerable? Now, a lot of times static analyzers will flag this as a vulnerable item. So is it a false positive? Is it vulnerable? Is it mitigated by design? What's actually going on here? Well, first off, again, we're talking .NET. By default, it's auto-encoded by ASP.NET because there's a flag called enable header checking, which automatically encodes any carriage return line feeds that come in. Okay, so we're pretty good there. So maybe that means we have to check. We have to understand the configuration file to understand whether this would actually vulnerable code or not. Because if it's auto encoding, we don't want to encode it ourselves, and then we get double encoding, and it starts getting ugly. So we have to understand the config file now, not just the code level. So there's something to think about. Well, there's also, what are we running on? Well, in IIS 7 and above, they modified IIS so that if you tried to do a carriage return line feed in a response header, it will throw an error. It won't display the page. It just throws an exception and throws up all over the place. So not only do we need to know our web config settings, but now we also have to have an understanding of what type of infrastructure are we on to understand whether this is really a vulnerability or not. And the reason I like to walk through this really quick, and these are really simple examples, but they help us progress through understanding that sometimes it's not just looking at the code. There's more to it than that. And so we have to understand that from a security perspective, We need the dev side for this. We need this understanding, right? And from a dev side, it means I need to have better understanding of my frameworks. I need to understand the tools that I'm using. This stuff all comes into play to allow me to make better security decisions so that way we actually understand the risk of our app. So the next thing we need to think about is identifying our current resources and our skill sets, right? What do we have? What do we currently have for current resource within our organization, right? We have developers and they have all kinds of characteristics. If you think about the characteristics of developers, and I don't have slides showing this, but I mean, they're attentive, they're critical thinkers, their attention to detail, they're logical, they have all kinds of cool characteristics, right? They're inquisitive, they're curious, they like to tinker, they like to build stuff, they like to make stuff happen. Now, if we flip back over and talk about what kind of skill sets that the hackers have, the bad guys have, right? Typically, the biggest ones you'll see are passion and curiosity. Those are the biggest two skill sets for the breakers side of the house, right? You have to be curious. What does this do? Let me poke on this. Let me try to break that. We talk about QA. Go back into the app side, right? QA, they're curious. They know how to test. They're attentive to detail, right? They have to go through and follow certain processes. They have these skill sets that we need. Business analysts, they have skill sets that are available for us to be able to understand and do some of this stuff. So the first thing we need to do is we need to understand what type of skill sets and resources do we currently have? Do we have developers? Do we have BAs? Do we have QAs? Do we have project managers? Right? What roles do we have from an app dev side? What roles do we have or resources do we have within the security office related to application security? Right? Maybe your security office only has network guys. And they're great at firewalls and they're great at setting up routers and all this different stuff, but they don't really have AppSec skill sets. We want to understand that. So we start to understand internally, here's what we have. And then we have to start thinking, well, what skill sets do we really need? How many job applications or job postings have you seen out there where you can tell they're really not sure what they're looking for? Yeah, we need somebody to do application security. And then they start listing out that they want somebody that can fix the flaws and they can do the red teaming and pen testing and threat modeling. And, they're throwing buzzwords out there, but they haven't really taken the time to think about what it is they really want to accomplish. And that's something we want to do within our organizations. We need to think about what do we really need to accomplish? What skill sets are required for that? And then when we compare those to what we currently have, then we can start thinking, okay, here's what we're looking for to bring in, because we've already got people that can do testing. We've already got people that can fix the flaws. Let's get those out of there. Here's what I really need. I need somebody to help with policy. I need somebody to help with guidelines, maybe management of things. Maybe I need somebody that has high expertise in focused testing. And that's what I'm looking for, right? But oftentimes we don't do that. We just go with here's a generic template, let's send it out. We need to understand what these skill sets are that we're actually looking for to bring on board so we can then make the move to have better AppSec. Because without it, we're just going to start throwing bodies in there. And, in big corporate, yeah, it's easy for bodies just to get kind of thrown around. Nobody really notices. Nobody really does much. And, we go months without realizing we haven't done anything. If we actually start bringing it down and saying, what do we have? What do we need? Where do we want those things? Hey, I need to bring in somebody to do security testing. Do I want that in my security group? Do I want it in my QA group? Where do I want to place that, right? And that, again, breaks out of our silos. We have to look at the whole picture. Where does it make sense for certain pieces to be so we're doing things efficiently as we go through? So when we talk about the skill sets and the people that we have on source, developers, this is a big one. We all too often focus too much on just developers. And to me, that's an issue. I alluded to it before, right? You hear all the time, oh, the developers write crappy code, the developers this, developers that. There's a whole team that's developing applications, right? And as I pointed out before, everybody plays a part. So I want to focus on making sure everybody's getting a piece of that, right? They're playing their part. So when we look at developers, how can we get developers more involved as we talk about application security? Well, first off, we can make sure they're getting the training that they need. And that's general security topics. And when I say general security topics, that's more of just they have an understanding. They understand OWASP. They understand top 10. If I went to a developer and said, hey, can you tell me what cross-site scripting is? They'd actually be able to give me a comprehensible answer. That's really what that is. They understand the flaw and they understand general recommendations of how we can resolve that flaw. Then you can get more into language specific training. Hey, look, we use .NET, so I want to know more of the features in .NET. So as we go back to those code samples we just looked at, we can have a better understanding that the developers understand, hey, if I'm going to output stuff in a web form, I have to go look up and understand, does that control auto encode? Does it not auto encode? What does request validation do for me? What does it not do for me? They should have an understanding of all these features because while some of them are on by default and you just don't even think about it, you need to know what they're capable of and then what your part of that is so you can really understand your framework. Come up with some secure coding guidelines, work with the architects if you have architects, work with the devs, work with security to come up with some guidelines to help them out that as they're coding, maybe they're not doing certain things. Hey, we don't do inline SQL queries. I guess I tried to join those too early. We don't do inline SQL queries. You have to use parameterized queries. Some places you'll see you have to use stored procedures, right? I mean, that was a common thing for the longest time. Hey, you have to use stored procedures. It protects us from SQL injection, which is not true. You can have stored procedures that are vulnerable to SQL injection, also known for a long time. We just don't like to talk about it. So, but hey, we say we have to use stored procedures, but if a stored procedure has to use execute SQL, then it has to go through this extra scrutiny because that's where we can run into problems. We start coming up with these guidelines. We start coming up with standards that we're understanding that, hey, for cross-site scripting, we do this. For cross-site request forgery, we're using this type of technique to mitigate this and moving forward, right? But we have to make it aware to everybody. They have to know it's there and we have to enforce it. We have to think about static analysis. At some point, you're going to want to put this, it's the soonest you're going to find flaws. It can be pretty high false positive rate. But once you get in and start using some of these tools, they become easier as they go, right? Initial run is going to be painful. After that, and you've resolved some stuff, it levels out because you should be learning, right? These are also learning tools that, oh, I did this, it caused a flaw, I had to go fix it. I need to make sure I do it like this next time. I stopped producing as many flaws. So it has a purpose. But I put static analysis here because I'm a firm believer that devs, this is where static analysis exists, right? Devs should be running these tools. They should be managing them. They submit their code. It builds into their CI. However you want it to work, they have to take ownership for these programs to really work. And implementing static analysis, implementing dynamic analysis, it's not just as easy as saying, oh, we got a tool. There's really a lot to it. I'm actually going to have some more webcasts where we talk more about each of those, about some of the things we need to think about. We're going to implement these type of things. Quality assurance. Again, another group that we can take advantage of. This one's actually a big one because a lot of what we do in security is focused around testing. What does quality assurance do? They test. So why not take advantage of the people that we have that are already doing testing? They've been doing testing for years, maybe more. They understand methodologies. They know what they're doing testing. Security testing is typically not that much different. We just look at things a little differently. Whereas typically QA is looking for functionality or simple defects, like, maybe visual defects, simple things like those. And some of them may not be as simple. I apologize for using the word simple there because I don't mean to degrade it. But at the same time, most of the security flaws aren't as difficult to find either. right? Putting single quotes into fields or putting less than characters into fields and seeing if they get encoded. This is pretty generic stuff. It's not real difficult. So quality assurance, we can bring them into the mix. I mean, you imagine, I did an engagement with a client not too long ago, and I asked them, I said, how many people do you have on your red team testing? And the red team, if you don't know, that's the team that focuses on basically internal penetration testing. Their job is to test applications or network, find bugs, report them. So I asked, how many do you have on your red team? And they said, we have 5 people that test for the entire enterprise. And this is a big enterprise. 5 people that test on our red team. I said, well, how many people do you have in your QA department? And the response was somewhere in the neighborhood of 120. So I said, well, why wouldn't you then use the 120 to do some of this testing for you? And then you can have the QA groups focus more, the QA groups focusing more on the simple type things, right? Then you have your red team that has the high experience, in-depth security knowledge to be able to find those really hard to reach flaws. That's where we want to get them to, right? That's a little bit better for scalability because 5 people is not going to scale well, but 120 will. And what happens when I lose one of those 5? I lost 20% of my workforce. I lose 1, I could lose 10 of my 120, and it's not that big of a deal, right? We have to take a look at what we have internally to be able to help us out here. And so again, with quality assurance, we want to make sure they have the proper training. They understand the flaws as well, but we want to focus their flaw understanding on how they can test for things, right? That's where their understanding needs to be. They can do manual testing. They can do automated testing, which typically includes the dynamic analysis. Again, just like static analysis in devs, I'm a big fan. Dynamic analysis should be handled in the verification stage by the verification team, which is also known as quality assurance. There's no reason they can't run some of these tools. QA can run web inspect. They can go in and sign into White Hat and pull the results. It doesn't require specialized knowledge for that. But their purpose is to verify the app is where it should be. And this is just one piece of that. So it fits into their world. And then we talk a little bit about bug tracking, which we'll talk a little bit more in just a second. So manual testing for quality assurance, get them involved, start them small. Something as simple as single quote into each field. Look for anomalies. If you put a single quote in, you submit the field and it comes back with an error, it's something we need to look more at, right? It's not the end all be all for SQL injection testing, but it's better than nothing. Putting in a special tag, less than, test, greater than, right? If it comes back out just like it, that's bad, as you can see at the bottom. If it comes out where it's encoded, where you see the ampersand LT semicolon, well, that's good. That means we're properly encoding our stuff. These are really simple tests. Again, they're not going to find everything, but why are you waiting for your specialized red team crew to come in and find that when you've got a whole team of testers that could easily add these into their testing cases and start looking for this, right? Get them using a proxy. I'm a huge fan getting QA using a web proxy. It doesn't have to be right off, right? Build them up slow. Again, small course correction, not huge changes. We're not going to say, hey, you're going to start using a proxy and you're going to start doing this and it's all going to happen today. That's not our focus. We want to slow it down. We want to make it so it's consumable, ease them into it. But there's a lot they can learn by doing that. When we talk about bug tracking, for me, a bug's a bug's a bug. I mean, there's not much more to say about that. I don't know why we always force bugs for security-wise to be tracked in different systems. We got to track them over here. Track them where the developers are working, where QA is working. If that's TFS, if that's some other system, track it in there. Put a special flag on it so you know it's security. So the security group can then pull out reports, because if we need reporting on this, there's no getting around that. But that way you can separate out the flaws, but they're all maintained in one spot. Now the devs know everything they're working on versus having to go to 3 different systems to try to find what they're working on. That doesn't work. It doesn't work well. And I've seen it fail too often where things aren't getting closed. We don't even know an accurate state of where we are from a security perspective because the process is too convoluted, right? So we want to identify that they are security, identify where they came from, right? But track them with the other issues. If you need special tracking, build that in. There's always ways to do it, but try to get it as close as possible to all in the same thing. It's the best way it's going to work. Business analysts. Oftentimes we overlook business analysts for this, but I say we get business analysts involved. Again, they should have an understanding, a training of security topics. They need to understand what type of flaws they need to look for. Their type of flaws, typically less around cross-site scripting and SQL injection, more around logic type flaws. Hey, how does the application work? How could somebody abuse this when we talk abuse cases? And how can I get around that, right? What can I write a use case or a user story that's going to help me with this? And so typically what we see is we'll see a user story sent over to the dev team that says, hey, user accesses their own account, their account is displayed. And that it's a very basic user story, but it gets the point across. But we don't see is that user story that says user tries to access someone else's account, unauthorized message displayed. Right? We typically don't see that when we're doing these things. And that's where our problem starts to come in, because we get what I like to call the domino effect here, where when the BA writes the story in that fashion and they're actually having these abuse cases in there, well, then when it goes to the dev group, they see them, right? It's right there. It's explicit. Here's this issue. And they're coding for it. They're making sure that they're accounting for that to take care of it in their code and their unit tests and all that. Well, then when it gets to the test environment, well, QA also sees that user story. Now they've got to explicitly write tests to make sure, and they're thinking about it, right? So it propagates all the way through the system to make sure that everybody's on track with what they're doing. It's critical that we start getting everybody involved because it plays a part all the way through. And the sooner we start it, the better off it is. Now, I mentioned training. Again, training is critical. We can do foundational training. We can do role-specific training. Often, mostly what we do is foundational. And it is, a 2-day, 3-day course that we send everybody to. And it's a boot camp of information. And, okay, everybody's had security training. Role-specific, where we start getting more, well, hey, devs need to know more about how to code properly for secure cross-site scripting and SQL injection and maybe language specific, whereas testers need more of maybe like pen testing type training and looking at things from that level. BA is a little bit differently as well. Then I always push, do some short focused training sessions. And one of the ways we can do that is with a document I came up with called the Secure Learning Opportunity. And it's on the next slide that's coming up. And I'll talk more about that then, but also doing smaller sessions. One of the things I try to push, look, do 1 hour, 2 hour sessions a couple times a quarter across the year. And you can do the same training you just did in a 2-day or 4-day class. You just spread it out. So we're talking security all year long instead of in January when we're required to due to compliance. And look to create mentorships with the internal security teams. Share the knowledge, go sit with QA, go sit with the devs and help show them how you're testing, what you're looking for, how you're doing it. So that way they can better understand the processes and what's going on there. Here's the slide on the SLO, the Security Learning Opportunity. 15 to 20 minutes to a write-up. Say you've got CSRF, you write up. We've got the description. Here's the risk of what this flaw has to our organization. How do we identify it and how do we remediate it? Very simple. Doesn't have to be every flaw identified, but it creates a learning opportunity. So we document this, and then it's a 5 to 15 minute discussion, maybe at one of our stand-ups. Something pops up that we're able to go ahead and put this together and we can share it with the group. But now everybody gets involved. This was really designed to defeat what happens when vulnerabilities are identified and we just say, hey, Tom over in the corner, you go fix these vulnerabilities. We don't tell anybody else about them. Nobody fixes their ways, and we keep doing the same vulnerabilities over and over again. This is here to kind of help change that. So it's a free resource. Feel free to go out and grab it, use it. Send me feedback if you'd like. That's cool. But it's out there for you. I'm hoping it'll help people get a little bit further with that. Application inventory. This is big. If we don't know what we have, it's hard to secure it. This is one of the more critical things we need to think about from an application security program perspective is, do you have an inventory? We need to know what applications we have. We want to think about application name, owners of the application, right? The contacts for it, data classifications, description of functionality, whether it's internal, whether it's external. We need to know about these apps, right? Because this becomes important. I may not know what's a test. If I don't know it's there, then how do we know to look for it, right? If I need to run a report of, hey, show me all the applications that are classified as critical, well, then I need to know that. Where do I go to get that? So you want to think about doing an applications inventory and make it part of the SDLC that you have to update that on a regular basis to keep it current, because it's important that we keep that current. Also think about programming language, framework, third-party components. We see a lot of stuff these days where things are happening out there. A third-party component becomes vulnerable. We have it in our system, but you know what? We never even knew. And now we're vulnerable and we didn't even know it, right? So there's a couple things you can use. There's the OWASP dependency check. Looks more like for like DLLs that you're using. And then there's also retire.js, which will actually go in and look at JavaScript libraries that you're using, like Knockout or jQuery. And if you're using an older vulnerable version of that, it'll help outline that as well. So another good piece to think about, we'll talk about our application inventory, right? This is all the information from a security standpoint we may want to know if some announcement comes out. Hey, can I go query and find out which apps are vulnerable to this so we can continue going? Regulatory requirements, right? Does the app fall under PCIs and under HIPAA? What do we have for requirements there? The final thing we really have is defining those policy and procedure. And I hate to skip through it real quick, as I know we're running close to the end of time here, but we have to have policies and procedures out there. Go back to your organizations and look around and ask questions of, what do I have for an application security policy? What do we have anything that defines what we should be doing, what the process is? These are the rules that we really have to follow. And this is what security a lot of times should be focusing on, is saying, hey, we're going to define the policies, we're going to define these procedures. And your goal is to make sure you're following them, right? I'm not the developer. So here's best practices. Here's what we should be doing. If you're doing it, then we're good, right? And we'll keep refining the process as we go through. Oh, we're doing everything we said we should be doing. We find flaws. What part of what we should be doing is missing? Let's update that so we can actually do it better. And then we can keep going. Coming up with secure coding guidelines, top 10 vulnerability list within the organization. If you're running scanners, you're running pen tests and all that stuff, what are the most commonly seen vulnerabilities? Write that up. Write how you can protect against them in the languages you're using, and start sending that out amongst the teams to get everybody involved. It's really going to make a big difference when they have specific stuff, and you're not just saying, oh, do OWASP top 10. You're saying, hey, look, as a company, here's the things we see the most common across all our apps. Here's what we need to look at, and we can continue moving forward from there. All right. If you're using static and dynamic analysis, come up with some standards for that. Who's responsible for what piece? When is it going to be scanned? How often does it have to be scanned? What's the level of acceptable vulnerability? All those things are critical when we start talking about setting up these policies and procedures. So go out and look and see what type of procedures you already have in place. Do you have stuff defined about accessing data, encryption of data? There's all kinds of policies that can be written here. Obviously, we're not going to go into all of them, but it's just something we want to start thinking about. This is a critical step to application security, because without the policies, you don't have anything to back up you saying, hey, we need to be doing this. Well, there's no policy that says that. We've got to create these policies. Be wary. Don't create policies, though, that you're not able to obtain, because then you're always out of compliance. So it's a fine balance to think about there. You want it to be so you can move forward, but you also want to make sure that you are doing what you need to do, staying in compliance, and not shooting yourself in the foot. So just a real quick conclusion slide, right? Again, collaboration is critical. Use an application inventory. It's going to help you out immensely once you get everybody actually involved in doing it. Look into getting training, identify your resources and skill sets, because again, a lot of times we don't know what's out there, and then defining those policies and procedures. Final wrap up. So if you're not aware, I actually have a blog and a podcast out there. It's under DevelopSec, which is owned by Jardine Software. It's just a separate site I created. It's AppSec for the app teams, really. I mean, it's really more focused towards the application groups, developers, QA, all that. But it certainly is good as well for the security side of things. If you're security analysts, security engineers, feel free to go check that out. I think it's a great resource. I'm biased, obviously. I write it all, but I think it's helpful. If you have comments on it, please send me information back. I love the feedback. I'll get more out there. Real quick, before the last slide, this is all brought to you. I mean, I am Jardine Software, as weird as that may sound, right? So just to let you know, I mean, we focus on helping companies achieve value in application security programs. We're not a typical pen testing company. We don't actually write software anymore. I mean, I started as Jardine Software when I wrote software. And then we've switched into the application realm, the application security realm. And we're doing things a lot different than what a lot of other companies are doing. I do a unique 30-day advantage where typically other companies would be 2-3 day, maybe a week engagement. We spread that out over 30 days, and it's been a huge success. So, I mean, I would encourage anybody, if you're interested, you can see on the slide here some of the stuff we do, the program reviews, security education. We do pen testing. We do application testing. If you're in need for anything with your AppSec program, I encourage you to reach out. Hit me up on email. It'll be on the next slide, or Twitter, wherever. Reach out and have the conversation, because I love talking to people about application security. I want people to get better application security, and that's my push. I see where there's a way to be able to make things better and get you, the client, more value out of things that we're doing. And that's my goal. So if you're curious about anything, please feel free, reach out. I'd love to chat with you and, talk to you about what it is we can do better in the application security realm. So that wraps up this webcast. If you have any questions, it's really easier if you just email me, or hit me up on Twitter, but email me. It's james@jardinesoftware.com. I'm pretty quick at responding to emails, but I enjoy the conversations. You can find me on LinkedIn, follow me on Twitter. This is where I announce all of my upcoming webcasts that are becoming available. So look for those coming out. I appreciate everybody's time coming out for this. Again, I know we did it at noon this time. Maybe that wasn't the best time. We're going to play with times. If you have times that you think work better, let me know. But I'll put the recording up so that way you can get access to it. If there's anything you missed, you want to go back and listen to it, it'll all be available. So again, thank you for attending. I appreciate the attendance. I hope you were able to get some lunch while I talked for an hour. But again, I appreciate everything. Any feedback is welcome. Please send it my way. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you have ideas for content, feel free to send that my way as well. And I look forward to seeing everybody again. It was actually nice seeing some familiar names on here from the last time. So spread the word, get it out there, and I hope everybody has the rest of a great day going forward.